In the first days of my latest research trip, in April and June 2012, I experienced a reaction that revealed itself quite relevant and instructive with regards to the research and analysis I will be presenting later on. I met a female lawyer in her late 30s who worked at the headquarters of an Angolan bank within a newly finished high-rise on the Avenida Agostinho Neto, a long road extending the base promenade to the southern side of the city. I told her I was living in the bordering self-built neighborhood known as Chicala too, and was astonished with her reaction. I don't even look at it, I ignore it. I prefer to face south and to see these new buildings. This is the Angola I want to live in. She had no regrets regarding what her westward avoidance might be depriving her of, for example, the quite beautiful sight of the sun setting beyond the East African city. She accepted this deprivation as long as it meant she might continue to avoid contemplating Chicala's unpleasant edifications piled up by the ocean. Within the following weeks of my 2-month journey, I realized that this persistent aversion to Luanda's Musex, informal settlements, set in motion by upper-class urbanites, has become deep-seated in the Angolan and expatriate elite. When meeting architects, planners, developers, power brokers, and local authorities, I would take note of the arguments they produced against these non-planned territories. These were mostly related to the illegality of the constructions, a situation seen to afford the government and real estate agents full legitimacy in taking over sites to rebuild them according to an official planning framework. This investigation sought to challenge these radical opinions which refuse to acknowledge the richness pervading the non-planned territories. It raises questions regarding the official strategies which aim to usher out the Musex. Through the deciphering of a particular case, Chicala, the study presents urban informality as a coherent possibility, deserving of its rightful place in Luanda's social and urban order. The resistance to informality in relation to Luanda's official order is best understood when one starts to address the site's colonial and post-colonial history. Up until independence, in 1975, the site was a popular beach punctuated by a few fishermen huts. The area started changing rapidly and profoundly in the post-colonial era as large swaths of the population shifted across Angola, fleeing the civil war, which lasted until 2002. This is a recent photo I took of the site. But the city's post-conflict boom comprises to irreversibly transform the area. Chicala is earmarked for demolition and replacement by a top-notch financial and residential district. The new development's first phase has been implemented, consisting of a row of 6 to 10-story buildings and a number of 2-floor villas arranged around the cul-de-sac. But according to certain unofficial sources, this project has been cancelled, with a new master plan drawn up to replace it. Secret plans, orchestrated contradictions, and a paucity of official information are hallmarks of Luanda's regeneration policies. This image shows the area's current state of development in dialogue between the new and the existing fabric. The site's immediate surroundings are defined by Luanda's political and administrative center, represented by the red border, a mediator of sorts between Chicala and the city. Taking a broader perspective, we realize that the master plan for Chicala is actually part of a much larger process that aims at dramatically changing the city's profile. However, some are speaking out against the regeneration process. In May 2008, in a speech given in Lisbon during a summit on sustainable development, the activist Bob Geldof declared, "The most expensive houses on the planet are on the shoreline of Luanda. More expensive than Chelsea, more expensive than Central Park West, Luanda." 2 years later, in June 2010, the world's leading provider of consulting, outsourcing, and investment services proved Geldof right. Luanda was considered the world's most expensive cities in 2010 and again in 2011, and it lost the top spot to Tokyo in 2012. Pro-business policies offer major land concessions to commercial developers, mostly to international companies willing to create a new Luanda for the 21st century, packed with air-conditioned glass boxes hardly suited to local conditions. The strategies in place have little consideration for sustainability or adaptation, falling prey to a model of Western modernity, which has in the meantime grown outdated in the West. This is probably the most striking example of the real estate bubble, the Chinese ghost town shown in the film. And this is still the reality. 3/4 of Luanda's 6 million residents currently live amongst the endless mosaics. In 2008, Angola's President José Eduardo dos Santos, recognizing the lack of economically accessible housing available to the majority of Angolans, promised to build 1 million houses in 4 years, 2008-2012. In the same year, Angola's housing policies were recognized by UN Habitat, with Luanda chosen to host the celebrations for the World Habitat Day under the topic Harmonious Cities. The 1 million project was set in motion. This image shows the resettlement camp in Panguila, which you've seen also in the film. The peripheral resettlement colonies of Zango and Panguila, among other areas, are deemed the solution for the housing problem. The distances to the city are around 15 to 20 kilometers. But in reality, the program seems to be aimed at displacing people out of sight or out of mind for the sake of real estate investment. In July 2010, the Panguila areas was removed from Luanda's jurisdiction and is now part of the neighboring province, Bengo. The over 10,000 families currently living there ceased being citizens of Luanda. Housing has not been the only victim of the official urban policies. This image shows the Roque Santeiro featured in the film, the market which Bia and 100,000 other people used to visit every day. Sorry for the bad image quality. It's just to show you the market at full swing. And here you can see it before and after dismantlement. Despite the urgency invoked in shutting down and relocating the market to Panguila, 2 years later the site remains empty, waiting for the implementation of a purified middle and upper class town. My contention is that the virtues of having low and mid-income workers closer to the city center and the costs of planning and building large-scale resettlement colonies for the poor are reasons enough for their permanence, economically sustainable and, of course, more socially just. But the government, however, continues to bulldoze illegal constructions. This is the contradiction of progress. Agents linked with global economic and political forces are capable of building and destroying in similar pace. Is there an alternative way of thinking urbanity that might gradually integrate the formal and informal topographies of Luanda, both of which equally contributive to the city's history, rather than subjugating the latter to the neoliberal policies of economic growth pursued by Angolan authorities and foreign investors since the end of civil war in 2002? I propose to answer this research question by looking at the city from the inside, focusing on Chicala as a case study for Luanda's many informal areas. I intend to do this in two manners: by delineating the site's historical context and by analyzing its social and spatial characteristics within the time frame of the investigation, 2010-2014. This quote sets the tone for methodology. The methodological approach is anchored on a post-colonial framework which reads the city as a place where the colonial distinction between formal and informal can no longer be clearly differentiated. I argue that, that the planned and non-planned topographies in fact comprise a reciprocity which has matured in fruitful ways. This research grants special attention to the very heterogeneity of society itself, which makes the terms and methods familiar to the social sciences relevant to the architectural analysis of Chicala and Luanda. My approach has taken shape in two different dimensions. First, an exchange between the observer and the phenomena observed. I have been living in Chicala for 1 to 2 month periods since 2010, hosted by local residents in this house you see in the photo. This direct experience of the customs and habits of my host family and their neighbors, assimilating the language, as Jane Jacobs puts it, affords a better preparation for their defense against, and quote Jane Jacobs again, against outside forces that should shatter their life. These diagrams show the house's constant evolution over time. The building's history is the result of the family's history, reciprocal to the neighborhood's history, and so on. And we will come to this later. One understands the house's gradual extensions when one learns about the family's expansion. The second dimension of my methodological approach is founded on the notion of fieldwork built on collaboration. I have been working with 4 local architectural schools since 2011. The methodologies put in practice have aimed to give all those concerned a part to play. The residents in consenting to describe their lives and show us their houses, and the students in empathizing with the people and documenting their testimonies. These are 2 examples of surveys. Site surveys have contributed to identifying the population's constituents, their living conditions, their meeting places, and everyday cycles. The material gathered is not merely organized into quantitative data, which might fall short on translating the site's actual qualities and meaning. Analytic analyses tend to flatten vital urban situations into a certain statistical sameness. In this investigation, tables and graphs are only relevant in the sense they inspire the formulation of insights that might shed light on alternative forms of living in the city. Moreover, any pretension of exhaustively converting rich urban topography into data is absurd. There is always a balance between depth and breadth, and forced to choose, depth is inevitably more illuminating. I will go now into the historical context. We will predominantly be looking at the area surrounding the study site. As Luanda's geography morphed over the years, this specific location, highlighted in the image, has remained relatively stable, resisting to constant shifting of land. Mutations of the island, bay, and broader coastline are a result of constant negotiations between water and land, a dialogue dependent upon natural and artificial phenomena. On the one hand, the city's surface area increases as a result of the displacement of sand by the water and or landfill processes. On the other hand, the so-called kalemas, ocean storms, often bring about conquests of water over land, particularly on the island. Before 1575, Chicala has its origins in the word meaning permanence. The earliest records of Luanda's island describe it as punctuated by scattered conurbations. I think we can see some of that represented in red. On Tuesday, the 11th of February, 1575, a Portuguese contingent comprised of 7 boats and 700 men, led by Paulo Dias de Novaes, approached the island from its southern side, riding the prevailing winds. They passed through the strip of sea enclosing the bay and settled on the island. On Saturday, the 26th of June, 1576, After protracted negotiations with the indigenous authorities, the Portuguese shifted their settlement to the mainland, where they built a military stronghold. The site offered abundant natural protection, with the island acting as a barrier, and an extensive plateau facilitating military control. But Luanda's evolution to a city came about less for political or military than for religious reasons. The Catholic Church's intention of settling on the coast prompted the establishment of permanent facilities such as a church and a bishop's residence by the coast. The governor's palace was erected in 1607. Over the course of the 18th century, the gradual silting of this area made navigation impossible, and access to the city took on a different route. Economic and commercial activities shifted from the fortress slope to the bay. To the northern side of the island became the main boat course. The desertification of the city brought serious problems, epidemics, etc. And the colonial government decided to open the city to the ocean by cutting through the hill, and this cut would become a decisive factor in bringing the study site closer to the city. In 1933, Salazar established a dictatorship in Portugal. This is a map from 1934 representing Portuguese former colonies over the map of Europe, claiming that Portugal is not a small country. And this was how the site looked like at the time. In the mid-20th century, ocean storms swallowed the stretch of sand connecting Chicala to the island. In the upper town, the construction of proper sewage and sanitary systems in the governor's quarters, including delivering manifolds of forms of waste directly to the ocean. This would become a decisive factor in shaping the study site, and I will show you how. A beach was formed due to natural silting, and it became one of the Portuguese population's favorite leisure areas. But the fall of the dictatorship in Portugal on the 25th of April 1974 set in motion troubled decolonization processes in all of Portugal's African colonies. Hundreds of thousands of citizens made a hurried and disorderly exit from Angola. The asphalt city became empty. Modernist residential buildings were emptied out, business closed down, and car traffic was replaced by lines of wooden crates, literally displacing the city's content to the port to be shipped away to Lisbon. The international airport became Luanda's most congested area, occupied first by the departing Europeans and then by Angolans massing to welcome their first president, Agostinho Neto. On Tuesday, the 11th of November 1975, Neto was finally acclaimed in the Largo 1º de Maio, renamed Independence Square. At this point, less than 1% of Chicala's current population were living in Luanda. The years that followed were overshadowed by a fratricidal war, opposing two internationally supported political movements vying for power: the MPLA, backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union, and the UNITA, with the support of South Africa and the USA. The MPLA remained in control of the capital, imposing an authoritarian single-party presidential system. In architectural and urban terms, appropriation of the former colonial buildings, finished or unfinished, became a typical feature in post-colonial Luanda. The city belonged to everyone in a perpetual organic process of adjustment of modernist architecture to an evolving Angolan modus vivendi. Luanda's vertical appropriation developed in tandem with an exponential horizontal expansion of self-built musecs, driven by the arrival of thousands of internally displaced migrants searching for security and economic prosperity in the capital. Meanwhile, this image shows how the site began silting in the area that would eventually become Chicala 3, right there. The diagram shows the establishment of Hidroporto, the company responsible for the landfill of Chicala's eroded area, using construction derbies for buildings around the city. Chicala's population remained low and relatively stable and up until the end of Neto's term as president in 1979. On Monday, the 17th of September 1979, he died in Moscow, and José Eduardo dos Santos became the second president in Angolan history and has remained in power ever since. The MPLA party announced that the body of their dearest president would be preserved in a mausoleum designed and built by the Soviets. Neto's mausoleum was erected in a place of a hill. The earth removed from the construction site was displaced to the natural sandbank at Chicala 2 in order to reinforce existing defenses against tidal erosion. The land on which Chicala 2 and 3 are founded is constituted literally of derbies from the city of Luanda. In 1991, the opposing parties reached a peace agreement, but the subsequent election process left UNITA unsatisfied, and the conflict reignited in 1992 with even greater brutality. Chicala's densification between this period reflects the impact of the war. Over 50% of Chicala's current population moved there during between 1992 and 2002. As the landfill process expanded, Chicala 2 and 3 became divided by the palace's peremptory sewer extraction outflow. This diagram shows the settling periods for the houses we've managed to survey so far. We have seen that Chicala 1 is longer established, followed by Chicala 2 and 3. Regarding the regions of origin, the population hails originally from most, if not all, of Angola's provinces, and predominantly from its northern regions. 40% of residents are original from which province? I edited a book about the ongoing workshops. It's here. I will leave a copy at the library if you're interested. Chicala is not a small neighborhood. Its cover showed the country's main road system and as continuous with Chicala's street grid. The neighborhood's history and demographic characteristics make it an arrival city, a notion presented by Doug Saunders, noting the perils of officials' failures to account for the influx of people towards cities, a process that has created urban communities of recent arrivals who became trapped, excluded, resentful. The aim of this investigation is to offer a contribution to alleviate Saunders' frustration, and I quote, "We do not understand this migration because we do not know how to look at it. We do not know where to look." So I created this map, an adaptation of the previously displayed map to the current historical situation, inverting the roles between the colonizer and the colonized. Angola is not a small country. Besides the primary role of fieldwork, part of our understanding of Chicala is sustained via what I have termed out-of-place practices, aiming at engaging diverse audiences with themes relevant for this research. Events, exhibitions, publications became vehicles of engagement, discussion, and interpretation. I will now go into the civic context. Now that we've got an idea of the historical background, let's look at the site as it is. I am going to do this in 4 stages. First, I'll describe Chicala's boundaries. Secondly, the distribution of key institutions, houses, schools, playgrounds, temples, industries, markets. Thirdly, infrastructure and services. And lastly, the street and alley network, which is the principal vehicle of communication between residents and between the neighborhood and the city itself. The morphologies of Chicala 1, 2, and 3 are defined by their bordering elements. When I say 1, I mean that. This is 2, and that's 3. Water is by nature Chicala's most prominent boundary. The piers are a residents' initiative facilitating boat crossing by hundreds of commuters every day, from dusk to dawn. Avenida Agostinho Neto defines Chicala's most public side, packed with shops and services. We might view the avenue as both a boundary and a filter for communication with Luanda. It is a symbolic link of sorts to the mausoleum. Arriving from Chicala 2's main street, the short crossing to the city center is made impossible by a cement block barrier. So if you come through the main street, you can't cross to the city. You have to drive half a kilometer here towards the mausoleum, make a U-turn back, and then right. The adjacent hill creates a topographic border that mediates the site's relationship with the city center. Opposite Chicala 3 to the south, the implementation of the first phase of the Sodimo master plan has set up an awkward urban situation mentioned earlier. The drainage canal physically separates Chicala 2 and 3. The canal flows from an in-situ T-shaped concrete plinth measuring approximately 8 meters long by 3 meters wide. You use meters here? Thanks. It has become the most permanent of the site's boundaries. The implementation of the new master plan implies the gradual removal of entire areas. So this terrain vague and this process of removing people is underway little by little. The empty land remaining on Chicala 2's northern side is a powerful reminder of the major urban change yet to come. Key institutions. This diagram shows the houses surveyed, as well as the schools, playgrounds, temples, industries, and markets. I'll start with houses. Field work undertaken covered a total of approximately 250 houses. Chicala has an estimated population of 7,000 to 8,000 families, with over 60,000 inhabitants, giving an average of around 7.5 people per family. There is a preponderance of what might best be described as hybrid types. A courtyard uses a kitchen, a freezer by the bathroom door and by the bedroom window. Within a covered courtyard uses a living room. Cooking pans sharing a tabletop with a DVD player and a TV. A wall simultaneously used for hanging clothes and pans. An oven a meter away from a bed, etc. Despite their ambiguity, these are typical situations which form part of the institutional order of house and the wider cultural context. Schools. The lack of educational facilities is evident. Chicala 2 and 3 lack state-run schools, and the few private facilities available are in poor condition. On the island side, recently built public nursery school attended by children from both sides on the neighborhood, which cross by boat. The proliferation of temples pertaining to different religions is perhaps the most representative aspect of Chicala's multi-layered urban life. Fieldwork carried out in 2011 and 12 identified 14 religions and 10 churches within the territory, high numbers for a relatively confined and apparently socially cohesive urban setting. 42% of the population is Catholic, yet there are no Catholic churches in the neighborhood. So this plan represents the Catholic churches at walking distance and the routes that churchgoers might take on their way to church. This is one of them, the oldest within the city center, founded in the late 17th century. Now, the Rema church is a special case. It is the main temple or meeting place for Rema devotees in Luanda. Rema is a Baptist movement. 60% of 300 weekly attendants come from neighboring areas. That's what the diagram tries to show. And I'm trying to represent that these facts help underlining that Chicala's dialogue with the city of Luanda and vice versa. It's quite constant, it works on both directions. That's a photo of the temple, which was actually built by a Chinese construction company. Markets. Historically, fishing has been the main commercial activity in Chicala. There is still a functioning fish market, but the activity is losing its prominence. The largest commercial facility operating in Chicala is a cement company. Only 2% of the buildings surveyed were found to be purely commercial, whilst 20% combine a shop and private living quarters. Over 50% of the population surveyed named the local street market as their most commonly used purchase point. I'll come to that. Interviews with quitandeiras, women selling wares at the market, revealed that products they had on sale were purchased at large open-air markets, which grew and developed after the Roque Santeiro dismantlement in 2010. In terms of infrastructure and services, in terms of water access, first, there are three main categories comprising the types found in Chicala. Official water, tap water from the public water company, EPAL. Informal water tanks, concrete structure usually built underground, so the water is kept cool. And water containers. Tanks and containers are available at informal markets at $20 or $30 per cubic meter, whilst tap water costs 30 cents per cubic meter. Houses with tap water or access to electricity have their facades stamped with a registration number by the respective official service, EDEL or electricity, or EPAL for water. Despite Chicala 2 and 3 not having tap water access, by the 2012 election campaign, most houses have been labeled with an EPAL sign, an electoral promise that the sites would be connected with the infrastructure of Luanda. Mains Power, managed by the EDEL company, was eventually supplied to Chicala 2 and 3 during the 2008 and 2012 election campaigns, respectively. And the diagram shows the results of the survey we did in 2011, when the electricity available in Chicala 3 was mostly supplied by generators. And this is what happened in 2012. Mains Power reached pretty much the entire area. And this is an important moment. People's voting power exerts a significant influence on Luandan politics. Upgrading is possible if rulers are interested enough. Diverting electricity from an external source, with or without the owner's consent, is still a recurrent element. When the owner's consent exists, this practice may simply be a way of sharing electricity expenses. The networks of institutional connectivity within the neighborhood are best understood when addressing the arteries of interconnectedness. These can be classified into three main categories: main streets, secondary alleys, and tertiary courtyards. And the namings we see there, Chicala streets and alleys, is a relevant object of study in the sense that this naming contributes to the neighborhood's sense of place. Important dates or regions metaphorically represent the country's history within the site's borders. Starting with courtyards. These can be private or semi-public places often shared between a group of houses, forming literal condominiums. Alleys are narrow pedestrian paths connecting the streets to the inner world of the blocks. This is an alley and two girls looking at the photo in 2010. And these are the same girls holding a magazine with their picture on it over a year later. Streets support automobile access, and a mixed housing commercial character. I will focus on a specific one, Chicala's main street, Rua da Pracinha, on an east-west axis. Photos of a recently opened exhibition in Porto representing Chicala's main street in full scale will be used. The fact that the site accommodates such diverse civic institutions results partially from the capacity of its main street to structure the fruitful coexistence of people and uses. The main street is, by nature, the neighborhood's primary place for interaction, the city's most authentic reason for being. It is a microcosm of the entire diversity of urban life, where people of different classes, origins, ethnic groups, ages meet. Personal styles, performances, and cultural practices become valid meters for being cosmopolitan in Chicala. In its toponymy, Rua da Pracinha implies a space that is simultaneously street, square, and market. A direct translation would be square street or market street. In Angola, the Portuguese word pracinha can be taken to mean both square and market. This concept implies that work plays an important part in everyday life. Scrutiny of the residents' areas of work or study clearly show that how the site actually functions as part of a larger urban metabolism. Over half of the local residents commute to the city center or its immediate surroundings. So the Rua da Pracinha plays not only an important role in the neighbors' day-to-day function, it is also the route taken every day by many Chicala residents on their way to work or study at distinct points throughout the city. This plan gives a topographical dimension to these facts at a city-wide scale. The centrality of Luanda, the centrality of Rua da Pracinha, confirms Jennifer Robinson's suggestion that, quote, in the street, in poorer contexts, much of contemporary urbanism is enacted. It becomes a crucial setting for inventing ways of being sociable, ways of securing opportunities to earn money, and ways of gaining recognition, end of quote. For all these reasons, I believe we can learn from Chicala if we only know how to look closely. We can grasp each feature and as a microcosm of a larger urban continuum, in this case, Luanda's. The work I have been presenting proposes a perspective of Angola's capital, often ignored in accounts of the country's current neoliberal trajectory. Part of my approach has been to present these research methods and findings to institutions unaware of or resistant to Chicala and the MUSEX in general. In the back, there, some of you might recognize Alexis Sorna. He used to work here at the CCA. I met him in Porto at the opening. It was really funny. It's a small world. Dissemination of the project to the public sphere is seen as a strategy of legitimation inspired by Ai Weiwei's dictum, if it's not publicized, it's like it never happened. Ai Weiwei will be the next guest on this series next week. As examples of this tactic, these two articles, published by the Financial Times in July 2012, raise awareness of the urban and economic conflicts embedded in Chicala. I will not read all of that. But I often remember Teddy Cruz's words, exalting the social and political dimension of our profession. We, as artists and architects, can be the translators of an ethical knowledge, of an intelligence embedded in these communities of practice. As a finishing note, I would like to reinforce how this research has involved dozens of students and residents. At the end of my latest research trip in June 2012, I organized a fete, a public ceremony in one of Luanda's most important venues. The city was invited to celebrate Chicala's culture through music, exhibitions, capoeira, and film. And the project's participants were honored for their work. The amount of interest the event generated showed some promise of symbiosis between Chicala and Luanda. So I like to view this occasion as a kind of a device exemplifying how architects and urban practitioners can contribute to create a kind of collective memory of a place. By bringing Chicala to Elinga Theatre, I made many who might usually avoid looking at the neighborhood see inhabitants for who they really are and applaud what they do. Thank you.